Part 1, Some background. My name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just call myself Dan, 34M at the time this started. My father built a mid-sized commercial printing and packaging company from nothing over about 35 years, the kind of unglamorous, profitable business that quietly employs 60 people and does several million a year in revenue without anyone outside the industry ever hearing of it. I'd worked there since I was 19, starting on the production floor during summers, working my way up through operations, and by the time this story starts I was VP of operations. Not the owner, my father still held that title, but functionally the person who kept the place running day to day. My older brother, Steve, 37M, had zero interest in the business and had built his own separate career in a completely different field, which was fine. Nobody ever pressured him to be involved, and he was happy that way. What matters for this story is Steve's wife, my sister-in-law, who I'll call Renee, 36F at the time. Renee had a business degree, a lot of confidence, and, this took me years to fully see clearly, an almost pathological need to be perceived as the smartest, most competent person in any room she occupied. She'd bounced between a few corporate jobs over the years, always leaving under vaguely explained circumstances, always with a story about how her previous employer just couldn't handle someone who actually got things done. About 4 years before this story starts, my father, in a decision I did not push back on hard enough at the time, hired her into a director-level marketing and business development role at the company, mostly as a favor to Steve and because she'd talked a genuinely good game in the interview. I want to be fair here, Renee wasn't incompetent. She was actually decent at the external-facing parts of the job, client relationships, trade show presence. The company's rebrand a couple years in was legitimately her work and it was good work. The problem was everything else. She had a habit of taking credit for other people's projects in front of my father, undermining people quietly in one-on-one conversations while being warm and charming in group settings, and, this became the central issue of this whole story. She had begun, subtly and over a long period of time, working to position herself as my father's true successor, instead of me. I didn't find this out all at once. It built over about 2 years. In small ways I kept explaining away because she was family and because I genuinely wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. Comments to my father like, "I just worry Dan's more of an operations guy, you know? Not really a big picture thinker." Meetings I wasn't invited to that I definitely should have been in. A pattern, once I started actually paying attention, of her scheduling one-on-one lunches with my father roughly every other week, always framed as, just catching up, during which, I eventually learned, she was subtly, consistently making the case that the company's future needed fresh strategic vision, a phrase that was doing a lot of work to imply I didn't have any. The thing that made this urgent, rather than just an annoying ongoing family dynamic, was my father's health. He'd had a heart scare about 18 months before this story really kicks off, nothing fatal, he recovered fine, but it forced the family to start actually talking about succession planning and the eventual transfer of ownership, which up to that point had always been a vague someday conversation. And that's exactly when Renee's campaign accelerated. I want to give a couple of specific, smaller examples before I get into the main story, because I think they matter for understanding just how gradual and low-grade all of this was, and why it took me so long to see the shape of it. There was a trade show, about a year and a half before everything came to a head, where I'd spent 3 weeks putting together a completely reworked pricing structure for our largest product line, in response to a competitor who'd started undercutting us on a handful of accounts. It was genuinely some of the best analytical work I'd done at the company, pulled together cost data, margin data, competitor intelligence from our sales team, modeled out 3 different pricing scenarios. I presented it to my father in a private meeting, he loved it, we implemented it, and it ended up protecting close to $400,000 in annual revenue we would otherwise have lost to that competitor. About 4 months later, at a regional industry dinner, I watched Renee describe the pricing restructuring we did last year to 2 other business owners at our table, in first-person plural in a way that strongly implied she'd led it, while I sat 2 seats down saying nothing, partly out of politeness and partly because objecting in that setting would have made me look small. My father was at that table. He didn't correct her either. I told myself it was a harmless slip, the kind of thing people do at industry dinners where everyone's a little bit performing for each other. I've since revised that read considerably. There was also a pattern with hiring. Renee had, over about 2 years, developed a habit of being the one who happened to mention candidates to my father for roles that had nothing to do with her department: a new controller, a warehouse manager, eventually even a production supervisor, always framed as, "I just know someone great, you should really talk to them," which on its own is completely normal. People refer candidates all the time. What I noticed, once I started actually tracking it, was that a disproportionate number of these referred candidates ended up being people who, once hired, seemed to report information back to Renee informally, outside their actual chain of command, in a way that started to feel less like networking and more like she was quietly building a small internal information network that fed her insight into parts of the business she had no formal authority over. None of this, on its own, was damning. All of it, together, over 2 years, was a pattern. But patterns are hard to prove and easy to dismiss individually, which is exactly why it took the actual discovery of the succession documents to make me finally sit down and look at the whole picture at once instead of one forgivable incident at a time. Part 2, the discovery. The specific thing that lit the fuse was almost an accident, like these things usually are. I was covering for my father's assistant, who was out sick, and helping organize some folders on the shared drive ahead of a meeting with our outside accountant and estate attorney. We weren't a huge corporation with an actual board, but my dad had an informal advisory group of 3 people: his accountant, his lawyer, and an old business school friend of his, who he ran major decisions past. I found a folder I didn't recognize, labeled with an innocuous name, that turned out to contain draft succession planning documents. Drafts. Multiple versions, showing edits over time. And in the most recent draft, the language had shifted in a way that made my stomach drop. Earlier drafts, from about 2 years back, described a fairly standard plan, majority ownership eventually transferring to me as the child actively working in and running the business, with some kind of equitable but smaller financial provision for Steve, who had no operational role and no interest in one. The most recent draft, dated just 6 weeks earlier, described something completely different: a plan where ownership would transfer into a family trust with professional management oversight, under which Renee, specifically named, not Steve, Renee, would serve as the managing trustee and effectively run the company, with me retained in an operations advisory capacity, a title with a lot of words in it that meant, in practice, no actual authority. I sat with that document for a long time. I want to be honest that my first reaction wasn't even anger, it was confusion. How had this happened? How had my father, who I trusted and who had watched me build the last decade of my life around this company, arrived at a plan like this without me having any idea it was even being discussed? The answer, once I started actually digging with clear eyes instead of family loyalty blinders on, was that Renee had spent 2 years running a long, patient, and extremely well-executed campaign to convince my father, in private one-on-one conversations, that I lacked the strategic vision to grow the company, while simultaneously positioning herself, in those same conversations, as the person with the fresh outside perspective needed to take it to the next level. And she'd done it so gradually, and so exclusively in private settings with no witnesses, that there was no single moment I could point to and say, that's when it happened. It had just accumulated, drip by drip, over 2 years, while I was on the production floor and in client meetings actually running the place. Part 3, deciding not to panic. My first instinct, honestly, was to march into my father's office and just tell him everything I suspected. I'm glad I didn't, and here's why. I had no proof of intent or manipulation, only a document showing a changed plan, which my father could very reasonably say was simply his own evolving thinking, nothing to do with anyone whispering in his ear. If I stormed in accusing Renee of some kind of scheme, with nothing concrete, I would look paranoid, petty, and threatened, which, incidentally, is exactly the narrative Renee had spent 2 years quietly building about me anyway. Dan gets defensive when anyone questions how things are run, I later learned was a phrase she'd used more than once. So I did the same thing I imagine a lot of people on this sub have done in similar situations. I stopped reacting and started documenting. Step 1. I talked to an estate and business succession attorney, privately, on my own dime, completely separate from the family's usual attorney, who I no longer fully trusted to be neutral, given how closely he'd apparently been looped into these recent draft changes without ever mentioning them to me. I explained the whole situation. She told me something that reframed my entire approach. This wasn't really a legal problem yet. My father was fully within his rights to leave the company to whoever he wanted, however he wanted, full stop. No court in the world would touch that. This was a trust and relationship problem. The only way to fix it was to get accurate information in front of my father directly, from a source he'd trust, in a way that didn't look like a turf war between his kids. Step 2. I started keeping a careful, dated log. Every instance I could specifically recall or newly observe of Renee taking credit for work that wasn't hers, undermining a decision of mine in a meeting while praising it privately to my father later as though it had been her idea, or scheduling private time with my father that excluded me from conversations that were, by any reasonable definition, operations conversations I should have been part of. I didn't invent anything or exaggerate. I was genuinely worried about becoming as unreliable a narrator as I suspected she was being, so I stuck to things I could actually verify: emails, calendar invites, meeting notes, project timelines that showed who actually did what and when. Over about 6 weeks, that log grew to 11 separate entries I could actually stand behind with documentation. A few examples, stripped of identifying detail. A calendar invite showing a budget planning lunch between Renee and my father on a Tuesday when I'd specifically asked, the week before, to be included in any conversation touching next year's operations budget, since operations was my department. I wasn't included. I found out about the lunch only because my father's assistant, not thinking anything of it, mentioned in passing that she'd booked the usual spot for them. An email thread, forwarded to me weeks later by a project manager who didn't fully understand its significance, in which Renee had suggested to my father, almost in passing, that maybe it's worth exploring bringing in outside operational consulting at some point, just so we're not too reliant on any one internal perspective, sent 9 days after I'd pushed back, correctly as it turned out, on a proposal of hers to expand our trade show budget by 30% without a clear ROI case. 2 separate instances, about 5 weeks apart, where a decision I'd made on the production floor, rescheduling a supplier delivery to avoid a costly rush fee, and consolidating 2 smaller print runs into one to save on setup costs, showed up almost verbatim in a cost efficiency slide in one of Renee's quarterly marketing presentations to my father, credited generally to the team, with no specific attribution to me, in a context where the natural reading for anyone in the room would be that marketing had identified these savings. I want to be clear that individually, any one of these could be explained away as ordinary office friction, the kind of thing that happens in every company everywhere and doesn't mean anything sinister. That's exactly why I didn't act on the log alone. I knew that if I brought 11 soft, circumstantial entries like this to my father, the most likely outcome was that he'd see it as me building a grievance case against my brother's wife, not as evidence of an actual problem. The log mattered to me privately, for my own sanity and clarity, but I understood from the start it was never going to be the thing that actually moved anyone. Step 3, and this is the part that ended up mattering most, I started paying much closer attention to the operational and financial side of what Renee was actually doing in her role, rather than just the political maneuvering. Once I looked, really looked, with the same rigor I'd apply to any vendor contract or production line audit, I found something concrete. Renee had, over the previous 14 months, been quietly steering an increasing share of the company's marketing and event budget toward a boutique marketing consultancy for strategic brand consulting. On paper this looked normal. Companies use outside consultants all the time. Except when I actually dug into who owned this consultancy, I found it was run by Renee's college roommate, a fact she had never disclosed to my father, to me, or to our finance director, and which represented a fairly clear conflict of interest under the vendor policy my father himself had put in place years earlier requiring any related party vendor relationships to be disclosed and approved. Over 14 months, we'd paid this consultancy just under $190,000, a rate that, when I had our finance director quietly benchmark it against 3 comparable firms, came in at roughly 40% above market rate for equivalent work that, frankly, wasn't obviously worth even the market rate, let alone a 40% premium. I want to be precise about what this actually was, not necessarily fraud in a criminal sense, since technically the invoices matched the work performed, however overpriced and undisclosed the relationship was. But it was absolutely a clear, documented violation of a written company policy, using company money, funneled to an undisclosed personal connection, while that same person was actively lobbying to be handed control of the entire company. That was the thread I decided to pull. Part 4, Building the Real Case. I spent the next several months, patiently, quietly, the way I imagine anyone reading this sub has learned works best, building an airtight, fact-based case rather than a family grievance. I had our finance director, who I trusted completely and who, it turned out, had her own frustrations with the consultancy relationship that she'd never felt comfortable raising, since Renee outranked her, put together a clean, professional vendor audit, the kind of document that looks exactly like something you'd hand to an outside auditor, because that's exactly what I was preparing it to become. It documented the undisclosed personal relationship between Renee and the consultancy's owner, the above-market rates, and a comparison against actual deliverables versus invoiced hours that showed a pattern of vague, difficult-to-verify billing. Separately, I quietly compiled my own operational record, a clean, factual summary of the last 5 years, with actual numbers, revenue growth under my operational leadership, cost reductions I'd implemented on the production side, 2 major client relationships I'd personally built and retained, and a clear, unglamorous record of the boring, essential parts of running a manufacturing-adjacent business that don't photograph well in a trade show booth but that keep 60 people employed and a company profitable. I wasn't trying to attack Renee's contributions, the rebrand really had been good work, and I said so, clearly, in my own summary, because I wanted this to read as credible, not as a smear campaign. And then I did the thing that I think mattered most, instead of going to my father alone, where it would read as brother versus sister-in-law, he said she said, I arranged, through the estate attorney I'd hired privately, a joint meeting with my father's actual outside advisors, his accountant and his business school friend, the 2 people whose judgment he trusted most and who were, crucially, not family, and therefore had no perceived stake in who won. I brought them the vendor audit first, entirely separate from any succession conversation, framed exactly as what it was, a legitimate compliance and financial concern about an undisclosed related party vendor relationship in violation of written company policy, at a cost of nearly $190,000 over 14 months. I asked for their professional opinion on how a finding like this should typically be handled in any well-run company, with no mention yet of the succession documents I'd found. Both of them, independently and without prompting, said the same thing: this needed to be disclosed to my father immediately and handled as a serious policy violation, full stop, regardless of family relationships. My father's accountant, in particular, was visibly troubled, because, I later learned, he had, in fact, been present in some of the conversations about updating the succession plan, and this new information landed very differently for him once he understood the person being proposed as future managing trustee of the entire company had also been the person quietly steering nearly $190,000 in undisclosed, above-market payments to a personal connection. I remember that meeting with the 2 advisors very specifically because of how anticlimactic it felt in the moment, which in hindsight I think was exactly the point. There was no dramatic gasp, no outrage, just 2 experienced, careful men looking at spreadsheets and asking pointed, boring questions. Who approved this? Was this benchmarked against anything? Why wasn't this flagged at the time it started? The kind of unglamorous due diligence that doesn't make for exciting television but is exactly what actually protects a business. My father's business school friend, in particular, made a comment I've held on to since: the money's actually the least interesting part of this. The interesting part is what it tells you about judgment. That line ended up mattering more to how my father eventually processed all of it than any specific dollar figure did. Part 4.5, The Near Miss. I have to include one moment from this period because it genuinely almost derailed everything, and I think it's a useful cautionary detail for anyone else in a similar slow burn situation. About 2 weeks before the meeting with my father's advisors, at a completely unrelated family barbecue, Renee cornered me by the drink cooler. I don't think this was accidental, in hindsight, and said, in a tone that was warm on the surface but had an edge underneath it that I'd learned to recognize, something like, "Hey, I know things have felt a little tense between us lately at work. I just want you to know I see you as such an important part of what your dad's built. I hope you know that." It was, I realized only after replaying it several times that night, almost certainly a probing move, a way of checking whether I'd picked up on anything, without her having to ask directly. I told her, honestly, that I appreciated that, and left it there. I did not let on that I'd found the succession drafts. I did not let on that our finance director and I had already started quietly benchmarking the consultancy invoices. I went home that night with my hands slightly shaking, not from anger exactly, but from the specific tension of having to be warm and normal to someone's face while holding something that large. It made me speed up, honestly. Not recklessly, I didn't skip any of the steps my attorney had laid out, but it made clear to me that Renee's instincts were sharp enough that the window for building this case quietly, before she sensed something and started managing the narrative preemptively, was probably narrower than I'd been assuming. I moved the timeline for the advisors meeting up by about 3 weeks from what I'd originally planned. Part 5, the meeting. At the accountant's suggestion, not mine, which mattered enormously for how this landed, we scheduled a meeting with my father himself, framed purely as a financial compliance review, nothing about succession, nothing about Renee's character, nothing emotional at all on the surface. I sat in that meeting mostly quiet. The finance director walked through the vendor audit clean and factually, dates, invoice amounts, market comparisons, the undisclosed personal relationship. My father's face changed about 2 minutes in a way I hadn't seen since his heart scare 18 months earlier, a kind of stunned, quiet stillness. At one point he interrupted her, quietly, and asked to see the actual invoices himself, one by one, on the screen, rather than just the summary table. He went through about 6 of them in near silence, occasionally asking a small clarifying question, and this one, what exactly was delivered for this amount, in the same flat, careful tone he used when reviewing a supplier contract he didn't fully trust. I'd seen that tone directed at vendors plenty of times over the years. I had never once seen it directed at anything connected to Renee. He asked our finance director, directly, how she'd come to compile this. She was honest. She said I'd asked her to look into the vendor relationship a few months earlier, and that once she started pulling the actual numbers, the pattern had been fairly easy to see, and that she'd have raised it herself much sooner if she'd felt she had the standing to question a director's spending without it looking like she was overstepping. He asked, at one point, directly, looking at me, "Did you know about this the whole time and say nothing?" I told him the truth. I'd found it about 4 months earlier, and instead of coming to him with suspicion and no proof, I'd wanted to bring him something complete and verified, because I knew how it would look otherwise, like I was attacking Renee out of jealousy over the succession conversations I'd separately discovered. I told him about finding the succession drafts too, at that point, because it no longer made sense to compartmentalize the two things. They were, transparently, connected. I told him I hadn't wanted to believe the two things were related, and had genuinely tried, for months, to find an innocent explanation for both, and hadn't been able to. My father did not say much else in that meeting. He thanked everyone, adjourned it, and asked to speak to Renee privately that same afternoon. I don't know exactly what was said in that conversation, and I've deliberately never asked, because I didn't want this to become about me extracting some kind of verbal victory lap from my father secondhand. What I do know, from what happened over the following weeks, is enough. Part 6, the aftermath. Renee did not admit any wrongdoing. From what I understand, her explanation, relayed to me much later by Steve, was that the consultancy relationship was just a favor to a friend who needed the business, and that she didn't think it needed formal disclosure since the work quality was good, which conveniently ignored both the written company policy and the 40% markup. My father did not find this explanation sufficient, especially not from someone who had, over the same period, been actively campaigning to be handed sole managing control of everything he'd built. She was let go from the company within about 3 weeks, not fired in some dramatic, public way, but a quiet, mutually worded, stepping down to pursue other opportunities arrangement, which I actually didn't fight for anything harsher, mostly because Steve was still my brother and I didn't need this to metastasize into total family war if I could help it. The succession planning conversation, meanwhile, reverted, not through me demanding it, but through my father's own explicit initiative, to majority ownership eventually transferring to me, with Steve receiving a fair, separate financial provision that had nothing to do with operational control, which honestly was closer to what everyone, including Steve himself, had always actually wanted. The hardest part of this whole story, and I won't pretend otherwise, was Steve. Family gatherings got tense for a long stretch. Renee, understandably, was furious with me specifically, and made that clear at more than one holiday dinner over the following year, framing me to anyone who'd listen as someone who'd gone digging for dirt out of jealousy. Steve, to his enormous credit, eventually told her, this according to my mother, who heard it secondhand, that he'd looked at the actual vendor audit himself, the real numbers, and couldn't in good conscience pretend it wasn't a legitimate problem regardless of who raised it or why. Steve and Renee are still together. Things between me and Steve took a long time to fully repair, probably close to a year of stiff, careful holiday dinners, but they did repair, mostly because Steve, once the dust settled, was honest with me about the fact that some part of him had suspected for a while that Renee's ambitions in the family business went beyond what was healthy, and he'd been avoiding looking at it too closely because it was easier not to. There was one Thanksgiving, about 5 months after everything happened, that I think about a lot. Renee didn't come. She and Steve told the family she wasn't feeling well, though everyone understood what that actually meant. My mother, who had been quietly devastated by the entire situation in a way she rarely talked about directly, pulled me aside in the kitchen while I was helping with dishes and asked me, point blank, whether I thought she and my father had failed as parents by not seeing what was happening sooner. I told her no. I told her the whole point of what had happened was that it was specifically designed to be invisible to people who loved and trusted the person doing it, and that it had taken me, someone in the building every single day with direct access to the underlying financial records, over 2 years to see it clearly. I don't know if that made her feel better. I hope it did, a little. My father, for his part, never gave a big speech about any of it, which honestly tracks with who he's always been, not a demonstrative man, more of a let his decisions speak for him type. About 3 months after the meeting, though, he asked me to have dinner with him alone, just the two of us, something we hadn't done in years without it being tied to some specific business matter. Over dinner he told me, fairly simply, that he was sorry it had taken something this serious for him to really look at what had been happening, and that he'd let himself be flattered, over the 2 years, by someone telling him what he maybe wanted to hear about fresh vision, in a way he should have been more skeptical of from the start. He didn't dwell on it. We mostly talked about an upcoming equipment purchase for the plant, actually, which felt oddly right. That's the language we've always been most comfortable speaking to each other in. Part 7, where things stand now. It's been a little over 2 years since the compliance meeting. The company is doing well, genuinely the best financial year in its history last year, following a restructuring I led that consolidated a few underperforming product lines and doubled down on the 2 major client relationships I'd built. My father, who since fully recovered and is in good health, stepped back from day-to-day operations about a year ago and now holds a more informal advisory chairman role, with ownership formally transferring to me on a schedule we worked out together with our attorney, cleanly, with no ambiguity, and, this mattered a lot to me, with Steve's financial provision built in as a completely separate, guaranteed arrangement that has nothing to do with company control, so nobody in the next generation ever has to relitigate any of this. Renee landed on her feet. From what I understand, she's in a director-level marketing role at a different company now, apparently doing fine. I have no ill will toward her succeeding professionally somewhere else. I just was never going to let her succeed by quietly maneuvering to take something that wasn't hers to take, funded in part by money that wasn't hers to spend the way she spent it. Steve and I are actually closer now than we were before any of this happened, oddly enough. We still don't talk business much. He's still completely uninterested in the company, which is fine, that was never the issue, but we've gotten back to a version of our relationship from when we were kids, before any of this crept into family gatherings. I think about the 2-year window before I found that first document a lot. How close it came to just happening, quietly, one private lunch conversation at a time, with no single moment dramatic enough for anyone to notice or object to, until it would have been too late to untangle. I think the actual lesson of this whole thing, if there is one, isn't really about revenge at all. It's that the most dangerous plans are the slow, patient, undramatic ones, and the only real defense against them is equally patient, undramatic, fact-based attention. There's a version of this story where I storm into my father's office the day I found the succession drafts, furious, and demand he choose between me and Renee. I've turned that alternate version over in my head more times than I can count, and I genuinely believe it ends badly for me in almost every branch of it. My father, faced with an ultimatum and no hard evidence, backed into a corner by a son who looked emotional and threatened next to a daughter-in-law who'd spent 2 years cultivating an image of calm competence. I don't think that version of me wins that fight. I think that version of me confirms every quiet narrative that had already been built about him being defensive and territorial. The only reason any of this worked was that I was willing to sit on real anger for months and let facts, not feelings, do the actual work. I'll also say, because I think it's worth saying honestly, I don't feel triumphant about this, exactly, even now. I feel relieved, mostly, and a little sad that it had to happen at all inside a family. Winning a fight you never wanted to be in isn't quite the same thing as being happy about how it turned out. Edit, a few people are asking why I didn't just go straight to my dad the moment I found the documents. Honestly, because I knew exactly how it would look. 2 years of quiet, private positioning versus me showing up with, "I found a folder and I think Renee is manipulating you," would have read as paranoid and defensive, which is precisely the narrative that had already been built about me without my knowledge. I needed something undeniable, not a feeling. Edit 2. No, I'm not going to share what industry the company is in. Several of you are trying way too hard to figure out who this is. Edit 3. 5 days later, to the people asking if I feel bad about how things turned out for Renee professionally within the family, no. She had every opportunity to disclose the vendor relationship honestly and simply didn't, while simultaneously working to take control of the entire company built by someone who trusted her enough to hire her in the first place. That's not a tragic misunderstanding. That's a choice, made repeatedly, over 14 months. Edit 4. 1 week later, several people have asked whether I ever considered just talking to Renee directly, one-on-one, before escalating anything. I did think about it, genuinely, more than once. I decided against it for a fairly simple reason. I had no way to have that conversation without tipping my hand about what I'd found, and once I did that, I had no way to predict or control what she might do next, whether that meant destroying records, accelerating her push with my father before I was ready, or simply getting better at hiding the pattern going forward. I wasn't willing to hand her the ability to prepare a defense before I'd finished building the case. Edit 5. A smaller number of people have pushed back and said I was cruel for going after someone financially rather than just having an honest family conversation about the succession plan on its own. I gently push back on the framing. I didn't go after anyone financially. I asked our own finance director to review a vendor relationship that violated a written company policy, using company money. The fact that the person involved happened to also be angling for control of the entire company is not a coincidence I created, it's the actual reason the financial issue mattered as much as it did. If it had been a completely unrelated employee with no ambitions toward ownership, I honestly think it still would have been worth flagging, just with lower stakes attached. Edit 6. 2 weeks later, final update. I think this is going to be my last update on this post, since the story itself is basically resolved and I don't want to keep dragging out details that are more about ongoing family life than the actual revenge arc people came here for. Steve read parts of this thread, by the way, not knowing it was me, since I never told him I'd posted anything, but he sent me a screenshot of a similar post from a completely different account with the caption, "Wild story. Kind of reminds me of us TBH, which I did not have the heart to correct. Thanks for reading, everyone. This community was actually a big part of what gave me the patience to do this the slow, careful way instead of blowing everything up the first week I found that folder."